And Nikhil also talks about that. I think he has a discussion with his wife, because Vimla is quite excited by the whole idea of burning foreign cloth. And he says, why do you do that? You know, don't wear it if you don't want to, but don't burn it in that sense. You're burning your resources and things. He also talks about how Swadeshi takes them by, you know, almost by surprise. It's like a wave. There's some very beautiful imagery which is used. I can't exactly remember it, but how suddenly we found ourselves going up on this slope. You know, we were carried away by the whole thing of it, which I think is an important factor, because when we compare it with the Gandhian movements later, that preparation, that whole sort of stage by stage kind of anticipation of the movement is not really there in the Swadeshi movement. Something happens, it erupts, and a whole lot of methods are tried out. There's, you know, different kinds of things coexisting. So it's something which almost sort of sweeps people off their feet at this point of time, and that is reflected in the novel Ghare Bayari.
You know, Suecheta, if we actually try to look at that, when Swadeshi movement is gathering, you know, popular support, it is spreading to other parts of the country. Now, how do you assess the British response? You know, besides, of course, the most obvious use of repressive methods to try to just quell the uprising which is happening, you know, protests which are happening there. But at a conceptual level, are the British also planning to, you know, think of ways to consolidating their hold on the system? We are just actually a few years away from what eventually gets to be known as the Morley-Minto reforms. Possibly you know, do you think that you know, this is also the formative period of finally being able to come out with the Morley-Minto reforms?
Well, yes. When it comes to colonial policy, we always know that it's not something which is fashioned overnight. It's normally always long years of preparation which goes into it. But in this case, I would like to put it slightly differently, answer your question slightly differently, which is that I think that there was they had already made what they came to realize eventually as a major political gaffe, which was the partition of Bengal. They believed that the Muslim consolidation that it would provoke would be so strong. We remember that Churchill had himself made the statement about how this is going to give to Muslim Bengal a kind of unity which has not been there even, you know, from the time of the Muslim kings and viceroys of old. So that expectation of a Muslim consolidation was not quite realized. The Muslim League was created, but everybody knows that Muslim League was just something, you know, the Nawab of Dhaka and a few of his cohorts. It is not something which, you know, it wasn't
get the kind of popular support.
Yeah, it isn't as if at this, and there are very many reasons for this, because there wasn't a Muslim middle class which had emerged by this time, let alone, you know, other social sections which had consolidated among the Muslims by this time. So there was not even a strong Muslim elite which was there, which was countering the national movement. In fact, some of the important leaders of the Swadeshi movement were Muslims, you know, and as Vishalakshi talked about, initially the movement got a very good response from the Muslims, as like in Borishal and Shal and other places, the Samitis, etc. There was a lot of participation.
But there were major riots in
I'm just coming to that. So as I said, initially it's quite complex. Initially there are what are known as scenes of fraternization, that has been described by Sumit Sarkar, the most well-known historian of the movement. And but then it kind of dissipates into Hindu-Muslim riots, and then there's a class dimension which comes in, because very often the Muslims are the riots and the Hindus are the zamindars. So that dimension comes, and that's something we must remember, because Bengal agrarian unrest has been something.
Does it mean, you know, that the British succeeded what they had tried to do? There was actually a Hindu-Muslim divide which they managed to just widen.
No, I think we must. You see, when the colonial state was not, to my mind, was not interested in just provoking some communal riots. They were interested in the consolidation of a Muslim bloc. The two are very different.
Okay.
The communal riots helped to, they were also in the interest of the colonial state because they helped to
weaken the national movement.
weaken the movement. But I'm saying that a political formation which was strong, could counter the Congress and the other, powerful groups at this time, the whole Swadeshi bloc, that's not something which emerged at this time. So the partition of Bengal was seen to be as something which could not be sustained. That is why eventually it was withdrawn.
Right.
It was recognized to be a failure in that sense. That's what I was indicating. So therefore, at this point, the many currents of that there are in the national movement, the colonial states, the response is to try and separate those, because if you separate them, then the movement gets weakened on the whole.
Right.
And that they are successful in doing, which is that, the whole strand of militancy, rather than being the core around which the moderates will eventually gather and around which there can be a incipient type of revolutionary nationalism, rather than that happening, three groups emerge. The moderates at Surat leave, and after a very acrimonious, I can't even call it a debate, including things like throwing shoes and throwing, chairs, etc. And militancy again kind of narrows into a revolutionary terrorism. And even and I think symbolic of this whole decline is Sri Aurobindo himself. I mean, Aurobindo Ghosh, the man who wrote the famous articles, New Lamps for Old, and associated with the Swadeshi movement, how he, goes on to sort of this life as a spiritual, exclusion, I mean, sort of living there as a, goes off to Pondicherry. So the whole thing kind of dissipates if you look at it.
Rohit, I want to ask you, there are different ways of looking at, even among historians there are different viewpoints on the divide and rule policy, and under this entire issue that Swadeshi, whether it was able to bring about a division between the Hindus and Muslims, whether it, what I'm trying to say is that the various ways of looking at this entire religious conflict within the framework of the Swadeshi movement and the British decision, which sparked off the movement. Which way do you, or rather, how do you look at this entire issue?
Well, I do not know if there is any direct correlation which can be established, but I think the fact that the support, which is an explicit support for the division of Bengal on grounds of religion, was not something which received very active Muslim support. It's another thing that a lot of people may have seen that a separate province would give them greater say and control. I think this has been recorded by several scholars that some Muslims, the middle classes and elite, did see that a separate province would give them a greater control that they wouldn't have in a united province.
Greater share of the power there.
Yeah, greater share of power and resources and so on. But the unity of the Bengali-speaking people was not a figment of the Hindu middle-class imagination. You see, the Hindu Swadeshi movement had a Hindu tinge or a Hindu touch to much of its symbols and strategies of mobilization. But the linguistic unity of Bengali-speaking people was very strong. And so I think this is a point which, for instance, say Bangladeshi Muslim scholars like Rafiuddin Ahmad, who worked on the way in which there's a slight erosion of this Bengali-speaking identity towards the end of the 19th century and so on. They have actually studied this, but what I would think is this, that the bonds of language in 1905 were strong enough for the differences of religion not to matter. But in terms of the British perception, one would think that having seen that it is not viable and that it provokes a massive response on the part of the nationalists, it is better to seek another strategy, and that strategy is separate electorates. So they offer separate electorates, and they, whether or not the deputation to Simla to meet the Viceroy was a command performance or not, it fitted in very comfortably with the British position. So it suited the British to have the creation of a separate body. and which eventually would become a force to reckon with as a symbol and a rallying ground, rallying point. But separate electorates would be the key, and that is introduced before the annulment of the partition of Bengal.
Right.
The 1909
the
introduces
the parliamentary reforms.
Yeah.
It's a very valid point which you made. We'll continue the discussion. It's time for us to take a little break. We'll be back shortly. A page from history will continue after a short break. In the final segment of this episode, we will talk about the factors behind the decline of the Swadeshi movement and discuss if the movement was a failure or did it make a major contribution in taking forward the idea of Indian nationalism. Be with us. Welcome back. 105 years ago, well before the arrival of Mahatma Gandhi from South Africa, the Swadeshi movement used some of the forms of protest that were later perfected by him and are now known universally as Gandhian tactics. This is just one of the main reasons for the Swadeshi movement to remain a major watershed in India's struggle for independence. Suecheta, before we went in for the break, we were talking about the reasons behind the British taking the partition of Bengal back. Why do you think it was decided? Because they felt that things are not working out in their favor, too much of pressure from the Swadeshi movement, or seeing, that Indian nationalism entering into a completely new direction which the British were not prepared for.
I think it's interesting to note that this comes after the parliamentary reforms. It comes after the movement has been smashed. This is something again very interesting about the colonial state. They would never have withdrawn it at the height of the movement because they would not like to give...
It would be like having a bloody nose.
Yeah, the impression that it is being done under pressure. But obviously the lesson had been learnt, and as Rohit rightly pointed out, now a different strategy is on the cards. They're going in for separate electorates, so now they can afford to annul the partition, something that they had realized, that it had generated so much opposition, and as Vishalakshi had also pointed out, importantly, not just in Bengal, but all over the country, the slogan of, Bengal Bhang, jo bhi hai, this thing, that, they had completely realized the folly of that action.
Right.
I think it's also interesting to point out that this is the time when the capital is shifted by the British to Delhi.
Yes.
So clearly...
After the Darbar move, the partition is taken back.
So clearly the realization is that Bengal or Calcutta is too much of a hotbed of political, dissent and protest. So it's not a very wise idea to be running a government from here. So better to run it from a place which is seen to be relatively stable politically. Right. It doesn't have that kind of a profile. So I think these aspects, both these aspects are quite important. Also, the fact that you must remember that this is really the time of, it's a very low watermark of the movement at this time. I mean, after the Surat split,
1907 and 1908 are actually very low years.
Very low years, and this is going to continue till the Lucknow Pact. In fact, the Home Rule Leagues come in the beginning of the war, and there is some amount of action, the Gadar movement, etc. But otherwise, at the mainstream level, there's nothing much which is happening. Surat has been a big blow, and so therefore the British can carry out this action from a position of strength. Like, it's not as if they have to eat crow. When they're annulling the partition, they're not eating crow. I mean, they're just simply saying, well, okay, we're going to look at it again. For an administrative point of view, it's not something we intend to do right now.
Right. Vishalakshi, Suecheta is saying, that 1907 and 1908 are very low years. Now, looking at the development of Indian national movement, prior to the partition of Bengal, it is in a phase, where, as sometime back in the discussion, you were saying, that poised to something was just poised to begin. Now it begins in a big way, it becomes a nationwide movement, but then suddenly everything starts coming down, slowing down. There is a general sense of disappointment. Do you also look at it as actually very low years of introspection? And if so, then why does it happen so fast?
Well, the first thing to remember is that any mass movement cannot sustain itself beyond a certain period of time. And somebody who calls for a movement should have a kind of sense of this, which obviously it would be unfair to accuse the Swadeshi leaders of not having had that kind of thing. This is one of the early movements, but perhaps Gandhi learnt from this particular episode, because after all he borrows a lot of the symbolism also from it and things. In fact, I think some of the Swadeshi leaders are actually looking at what Gandhi is doing in South Africa at the same time.
Exactly.
And they say that passive resistance has been much more successful there. They also use these words, passive resistance. They say we have not been able to do the kind of passive resistance that Gandhi has actually successfully carried out in South Africa. So this realization that there is a point after which the movement cannot sustain itself, people's ability to go on coming out on the streets, participating in all these kinds of movements and things like that, it cannot sustain itself. Financially, many of the enterprises that are set up, even the national schools, they don't have the kind of funds to carry on. And then there is the very heavy repression that is coming in from the British government. So all these combine by 1908 to create a situation where the mass movement becomes more and more difficult, and instead then you have the again the Samitis take over, and you have the Anushilan and the Jugantar groups, which the Dhaka Anushilan group has a certain character, the Jugantar group has another character and things like that. So they actually provide, after all this is the first real phase of revolutionary terrorism that you have, in which the methods of, one is of course targeting individual officials, top officials of the British administration.
What is now used, as the shock and awe tactics, trying to use contemporary language to describe what was being done by those groups at that particular time.
And the idea is that if you target the very topmost officials, then the system is such that there will be a kind of loss of morale, and the whole system will collapse. The second is, of course, that of again, looting and gathering funds with which you're able to bring out your publications, your literature and pamphlets and things like that. Later on, you have the mail van dacoities, which become like the Kakuri dacoity and so on, a lot of those kind of things. And then, the other, there is a certain amount of that, the kind of earlier constructive activity, but in a much more secretive manner. Now they have to be, they have to function with a very strong religious imagery also, which, these are the three characterizing features of this period. And as happens with revolutionary terrorism, over a period of time, they get identified, the groups get identified, they are arrested. This is also the time when the main three leaders, if you look at Lala Lajpat Rai, Tilak is deported, Lajpat Rai goes out of the country, he goes off to England, and so does Bipin Chandra Pal for a period of time, I think, because there are stories of Jawaharlal Nehru listening to Lajpat Rai and Bipin Chandra Pal in England in 1909 at the Cambridge Majlis and various other places. So the major leaders have also left the country by this time.
We have, already surveyed, the reasons as to why the Swadeshi movement, went on a decline at that time. Now, to have a, analysis from you, towards the end of our discussion, is that what do you think, was gained out of the Swadeshi movement? What lessons was there for the future generation of the nationalists?
One thing is very clear, that it quickened the pace of nationalism in India. So the movement lasted about 2 to 3 years, with varying levels of intensity, and that was probably the first, movement which had such a wide geographical area. Not just in Bengal, but in other parts.
All over the country.
All over the country, for a variety of local reasons as well. But
not just a single issue.
Not just a single issue, because there was the canal colony agitation led by Lajpat Rai in the Punjab during the same period as the Swadeshi movement. But the point is that it had a lasting impact in terms of creating a sense of a struggle against colonial rule by emphasizing Swadeshi, by emphasizing boycott, by emphasizing national education, by emphasizing the setting up of your own institutions, and sort of, you know, students staying away. As Sumit Sarkar has said in his book, you know, that most of the elements of the non-cooperation movement were there, except for this emphasis on non-violence. I think Charkha also was given I mean, self-reliance and Swadeshi are there earlier, but you know, the kind of emphasis given on Charkha, which is actually meant to create mass employment as opposed to just industry, is also probably a distinguishing feature of the Gandhian movement. This idea of mass employment, you know, production by the masses for the masses, is not there in the Swadeshi movement. So I think these two distinguishing features are there, and they play a very so it's an inspiring thing. Plus, I think a lot of the symbols, as has been mentioned, you know, by Vishalakshi Menon, that you know, things like the Bande Matram, and you know, it provides the literature.
It was really a very, very lasting you know, impressions.
Yeah, psychologically and culturally, it has a significant impact on people. Despite Tagore's stature, I think the people who did not accept his reservations on nationalism and religion were more important, I think.
Well, I'm sorry to you know, just cut this discussion short, but we have really run out of time. It's really been a very stimulating discussion, you know, on the Swadeshi movement, understanding a very, very important chapter in Indian national movement when actually things really started going. Thank you very much for coming and joining me on this program.
Thank you.
The biggest success of the Swadeshi movement was that it expanded the outreach of Indian nationalist thought and action. What remained restricted to meeting halls, posters and pamphlets till then was out in the open as protesters took to the streets. Instead of sending delegations to plead their cases, Indians opted to push the limits of the colonial rulers. The Swadeshi movement, like other mass movements, made way for another phase of the national movement, because it is only the first battle in India's long-drawn war for independence. We hope this program has refreshed your memories and given you new ways to interpret this important chapter of Indian history. We like your feedback on this program. Please write to us at historylstv@gmail.com. We shall be back again next week with another page from history and another panel of experts. Till then, goodbye.